The wind shrieked like a predator, a mournful growl across the vast, frozen expanse. Its icy breath carried stinging snow that lashed at exposed skin like knife cuts. Ryland pulled his scarf higher over his face, his breath condensing into a thin mist that clung to the thick fur of his hood. Each step was heavy, his boots sinking into the brittle ice that stretched to the horizon. This was no place for the faint of heart or the unprepared. He adjusted the pack on his back, its weight a promise of survival pressing against his spine. Emergency gear, thermal blankets, dwindling rations, the low hum of his personal heater vibrating against his chest like a warm anchor in this endless cold. Ryland had been alone on Artera V for nearly 3 years, surveying its harsh terrain in search of minerals and compounds that might one day feed the ever-hungry industries of the Earth colonies. It was a job for the desperate or the damned, and he wasn't sure which he was anymore. Overhead, the sky swirled with color, ribbons of green and purple twisting in slow, mesmerizing patterns, illuminating this world without night in an eerie glow. It was beautiful, almost surreal, and it never failed to put him on edge. Out here, beauty was always a prelude to something dangerous. A faint chirp from his scanner cut through the wind's howl, and he froze, his heart rate spiking. The device on his wrist glowed faintly in the dim light, its readings surging with erratic beeps. There was movement, but not his. Ryland's gloved hand hovered over the scanner as he adjusted its sensitivity. The signal grew stronger, a cluster of faint thermal signatures, small and erratic. Animals, he thought instinctively, though the idea felt wrong. Nothing survived out here, not in this cold. A few creatures adapted to Artera's brutal cold burrowed deep beneath the surface, their lives measured in slow, hibernating rhythms, but the scanner insisted. Curiosity mixed with caution, but curiosity always won. It was what had driven him to take this assignment in the first place, leaving the crowded stations orbiting Earth for this empty, unforgiving place. He tightened his grip on the reinforced handle of his ice axe and adjusted his course toward the signal. The trek took longer than it should, his path winding through sharp black crystal formations and ice ledges that threatened to collapse underfoot. The wind picked up, tugging at his coat with greedy fingers, but the signal only grew stronger. Then he saw it. At first, it was just a black smudge against the white, a shape half buried in snow, its edges blurred by frost and shadow. Ryland narrowed his eyes, his pace slowing as he drew closer, a growing sense of wrongness solidifying in his chest. It wasn't an animal. The shape was humanoid, though its form was alien in ways that made his stomach clench. Its skin, visible through the tears in its tattered clothing, shimmered faintly in the aurora, its texture like broken glass or frozen water. The limbs were long and slender, curled inward in a protective way, and a mass of what might have been hair, silver white or both, splayed across the snow. Ryland crouched down, gloved fingers trembling as he reached out to touch the figure's shoulder. He hesitated, his breath fogging between them. It was alive just barely. Its chest rose and fell in a shallow movement that startled him, and he pressed 2 fingers to what he hoped was its neck. The pulse, if it could be called that, was erratic, a rapid, alien flutter. "What the hell are you?" he muttered, his voice muffled by his scarf. The figure didn't respond, its face hidden by frost, still and pale, its lips parted slightly. Ryland shook his head, the pragmatic part of him screaming to leave it behind. Whatever it was, it wasn't his problem. Survival on Artera was a knife's edge, and his pack only held supplies for one. But then the figure shuddered, or rather, its whole body twitched, a weak moan escaping its lips, and Ryland's resolve broke. He cursed, slipping his hands under the figure's surprisingly light form and lifting it. The movement was clumsy, the limbs flopping limply, an arm brushing against his pack, and he could feel an unnatural cold radiating through his layers of coats. The journey back to his shelter was brutal, the added weight slowing him down, and the wind howling harder as if in fury at his choice to defy it. His muscles screamed in protest, and it wasn't until the familiar shape of his domed shelter came into view that he was gasping for breath. He staggered through the entrance, collapsing onto the metal floor as the hatch sealed behind him with a hiss. The sudden quiet was deafening, the warmth inside stifling after the endless cold. Ryland lay there for a moment, his breath ragged before he turned his attention back to the figure. He carefully lowered it onto the insulated cot in the corner of the room. Up close, the alien nature of its form became even more apparent. The crystalline patterns on its skin seemed to shimmer faintly, and its fingertips ended in sharp, translucent points. Ryland pulled a thermal blanket from his pack, covering the figure's body with it. He activated the medical scanner in his shelter, a crude device but better than nothing, and held it to the figure's chest. The screen flickered, struggling to process the alien biology. Unidentified flashed across the scanner's screen, and Ryland bit back a curse. The figure stirred, then its head lolled to the side, and for a moment, its eyes flickered open. They were unlike anything he had ever seen, glowing softly like embers trapped under glass. "Warm," it whispered, a ghost-like sound, thin and broken. Ryland froze, his heart pounding in his ears. It spoke. The low hum of the machinery filled the air, the only constant in the fragile silence of the shelter. Ryland sat cross-legged on the cold metal floor, the edge of his coat still wet from melting snow, his gaze fixed on the figure on his cot. He had wrapped the alien woman in his last emergency thermal blanket, tucking additional insulation beneath her fragile form. Despite his efforts, her crystalline skin still shimmered faintly, refracting the dim shelter light like a shattered prism. He was supposed to be cataloging samples for the day or checking the automated drills he'd deployed miles away. Instead, he found himself fixated on her rising and falling breath, erratic and shallow, a life so close to the edge but still clinging with an inexplicable determination. Outside, the wind howled, battering the shelter's reinforced steel walls. The storm showed no sign of abating. Artera V, in its infinite cruelty, wasn't content to grant him even a moment's respite. He rose, stretching his stiff limbs, and moved to the control panel near the back of the room. The interface flickered, casting a pale glow on his face. The station's systems were rudimentary, cobbled together with salvaged parts over years of isolation. He navigated to the environmental readings. The outside temperature had plummeted to an unbearable -82 degrees Celsius, and the wind speed was close to 150 kilometers per hour. There was no chance of venturing out again until it passed. Ryland sighed, running a hand through his disheveled hair. His supplies were dwindling. His oxygen filter was overdue for maintenance, and now he had a mysterious alien who was possibly dying in his care. As if things weren't precarious enough. "Why couldn't it have been a mineral deposit?" he muttered, glancing over his shoulder at her still form. As if in response, the shelter scanner gave a soft beep. Ryland turned back to the panel, his brows furrowing as he adjusted the screen. The scanner had been registering strange readings ever since he'd brought her in. Faint energy spikes like whispers in the electromagnetic spectrum. He'd initially dismissed them as interference from the storm, but now the patterns were becoming clearer, almost rhythmic. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. The spikes were concentrated around her. Whatever she was more than just biologically alien. She was radiating something the scanner couldn't identify, an energy signature that didn't belong on this frozen world. She stirred again several hours later, her body twitching beneath the blanket. Ryland was sitting nearby, fiddling with a makeshift heater he had rigged up to provide extra warmth around her cot. At the sound of movement, he looked up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They glowed faintly, two melting amber orbs that swirled with a hypnotic depth. It wasn't a reflection of the shelter's light. They seemed to emit a subtle radiance of their own, like embers buried beneath ice. "Easy," Ryland said, holding up his hands in a gesture he hoped was non-threatening. "You're safe here." Her gaze swept the small space, taking in the patched walls and flickering light before returning to him. When she spoke, her voice was light, barely more than a rasp and carrying an otherworldly cadence. "Where?" she asked. "You're in my shelter," he replied. I found you out there. You were nearly dead. Her brow furrowed, and she tried to sit up, wincing with the movement. Ryland instinctively moved to stop her. Hey, take it easy, you're not strong. Her hand shot out, gripping his wrist with surprising strength. The contact sent a strange tingling sensation up his arm, and her eyes narrowed. You touched me, she said, her voice holding something between accusation and disbelief. Well, yeah, you were about to die, Ryland said, trying to mask his unease. Didn't have much of a choice. She released his arm abruptly, her expression softening though confusion still clouded her features. She settled back onto the cot, her movements slow and deliberate as if testing her own strength. What is your name? Ryland asked after a long silence. For a moment, she seemed to weigh the question, as if considering the implications of answering. Finally, she spoke. Lyra. Lyra. He repeated, letting the unfamiliar name roll off his tongue. I'm Ryland. Do you mind telling me what you were doing out there? Not exactly a nice place to take a stroll. She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze drifted to the ceiling, her amber eyes darkening slightly as if retreating inward. I don't know, she admitted finally. My ship? There was a storm. A crash. Her voice trailed off. Everything else is unclear. Ryland leaned back, his instincts prickling. Amnesia? Or something else? The next few hours passed in tense silence. Lyra drifted in and out of sleep, her breathing still uneven, while Ryland worked tirelessly to stabilize the damaged heater and patch a small leak in the oxygen filter. The storm outside continued its relentless assault, and the shelter's walls groaned under the pressure. At one point, Ryland ventured into the small storage area to take stock of their remaining supplies. Food was critically low, down to just a few ration packs and a box of nutritional paste he'd been saving for emergencies. He cursed under his breath, his mind racing with calculations. When he returned to the main room, Lyra was sitting upright, her movements slower but more deliberate. She was examining her own arm, her crystalline skin catching the dim light and refracting it into faint rainbows. What are you? Ryland asked before he could stop himself. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment, she said nothing, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. Finally, she replied, I am not like you. Yeah, I gathered that. Ryland crossed his arms. But if you expect me to keep you alive, I'm going to need some answers. Her gaze hardened, and for the first time, he glimpsed something deeper in her eyes, a wariness as if she was calculating how much to reveal. I do not know if you would want those answers, human. Ryland frowned, but before he could press her further, the shelter scanner gave another soft beep. He turned to the control panel, his heart sinking as he took in the new data. Another signal, faint but growing stronger. Not from the storm and not from this planet. Something, or someone, is coming. The shelter scanner continued its rhythmic beeping, each pulse cutting through the silence like a ticking clock. Ryland hovered over the panel, his jaw tight as he studied the screen. The signal was stronger now, its source an enigma shrouded in the swirling chaos of Arterra V's storm. What does it mean? Lyra's voice cut through the tension, sharper than before. She had risen from the cot, the thermal blanket falling loosely from her shoulders, her glowing amber eyes fixed on the control panel, and for the first time, she seemed more present, less fragile. Ryland tapped a few buttons, zooming into the waveform. It's a transmission, but it's not local, certainly not from my equipment. He paused, glancing at her warily. Could it be from your ship? Lyra stepped closer, her movements deliberate and silent like a predator closing in on its prey. Analyze this frequency. It is not a match. Her eyes narrowed, her crystalline skin shimmering faintly as she spoke. Not mine, but it is familiar. How familiar? She didn't answer immediately. Instead, her gaze flickered to the small viewport fixed to the shelter's wall. Outside, the storm was raging like a living thing. It is a search pattern. Someone, or something, is scanning for life. Ryland's stomach tightened. He knew what a search pattern looked like. The telltale oscillations of a signal designed to probe, to find, to hunt. Who would be looking for you? Lyra's face darkened, the light in her eyes dimming as if shadows had passed over them. Not Elias. The storm outside showed no sign of abating, the wind howling as if to drown out any thought of escape. The shelter trembled under its fury, and Ryland felt the weight of his isolation more acutely than ever. The bubble of warmth and fragile air that protected him now contained an unknown entity, and now it appeared a new threat was looming. He turned back to the control panel, his fingers flying across the controls. If someone is scanning for life, they'll eventually find this shelter. The shielding is not enough to block this type of scan. Lyra moved to his side, her presence unnervingly quiet. You should leave. Ryland froze mid-gesture, his eyes staring at her. Leave in this storm? You would die in minutes without shelter. I would be better off than both of us. Her voice was calm, almost cold, but her eyes betrayed something deeper. Fear mixed with resolve. He shook his head. Not happening. I didn't pull you out of the snow just to throw you back to whatever is out there. Her jaw tightened, and she turned away, her voice low. You do not understand. They will kill you as well. Ryland leaned back, crossing his arms. Then perhaps you should start explaining who they are. And the explanation, when it came, was fragmented, scattered memories and veiled admissions. Lyra's species were not like humans. They lived on the boundaries of energy and matter, their forms both fragile and potent. She was part of something larger, though whether it was a civilization or a collective she didn't say. What she did reveal was chilling. They do not forgive weakness, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. I was sent here to survey this place, Artera. It was perhaps a mistake or an experiment. Her luminous eyes fixed on him, sharp and unforgiving. When I crashed, I became irrelevant, an anomaly that needs correcting. You mean eliminated? Ryland said grimly. She nodded. They will send drones first to confirm my death. Then if I am still alive, they will come. Ryland cursed under his breath, pacing the small confines of the shelter. His mind raced, calculating the odds, the risks, the sheer impossibility of it all. He had no weapons beyond an ice axe and a modified soldering iron. The shelter's defenses were a joke, its walls designed to keep out the cold, not intruders. Lyra watched him, her expression unreadable. You should still leave, she said softly. He stopped, turning to face her. Not an option. If these drones are coming, we deal with them. We. Her voice was skeptical, almost mocking. You do not even understand what you are facing. Maybe not, he admitted. But I know this planet.
I've survived storms, avalanches.
Freezing temperatures that would kill most in minutes. I'm not leaving. For a moment, they stared at each other, the silence thick with unspoken tension. Then, to his surprise, the corners of Lyra's lips twitched into the barest hint of a smile. You are either brave or foolish, she said. Perhaps both. The preparations were minimal, driven more by desperation than strategy. Ryland scavenged the shelter for anything useful, tools, spare parts, even the battery pack from his emergency beacon. Lyra, though still weak, offered insight into the drone's potential capabilities. They were fast, relentless, and precise, but they relied on technology. Heat signatures, movement, energy emissions. They do not think like you or I, she said as she helped him cobble together a crude EMP device from the shelter's backup generator. They only calculate. Great, Ryland muttered. Machines have blind spots, we just need to find them. Hours passed, marked only by the flickering of the shelter's lights and the growing tension in the air. The storm outside began to subside, the wind dropping to a mournful groan. The silence that followed was almost worse, an ominous void that seemed to stretch into eternity. And then the scanner beeped again. They are here, Lyra said softly, her voice tight with strain. Ryland checked the screen. The signal was close, too close. He gripped his ice axe, the crude weapon feeling pathetic in his hand. Stay behind me, he said, glancing back at her, but Lyra had not moved to hide. Instead, she stood straighter, the dim glow on her skin intensifying. I am not as helpless as you think, she said, her voice taking on an edge. Before Ryland could respond, the shelter's exterior sensors registered movement, fast-moving blips across the snowdrifts. The first drone appeared in view, a sleek, angular shape with glowing red optics. It was hunting, and it had found them. The drone hovered outside the shelter like a phantom, its red optics scanning the structure with mechanical precision. Inside, Ryland stood still, his breath shallow, gripping his ice axe tight. Lyra stood just behind him, her amber eyes glowing fixed on the viewport, her crystalline skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the soft hum of the drone's propulsion systems. Then, as if making a decision, the drone emitted a pulse of light that washed over the shelter's exterior. The control panel behind Ryland flared, warning alarms blaring. They are mapping us, Lyra said, her voice low but steady.
No kidding, Ryland muttered.
His fingers flew across the control panel, attempting to activate the crude EMP device they'd cobbled together. But even as he worked, a cold dread washed over him. This one drone was just the beginning. Lyra stepped closer, her presence calm but unnerving. When it breaches, I can slow it down, she said. How? Her gaze flicked to him briefly, unreadable. I told you I am not helpless. Before Ryland could press her further, the drone's hum intensified, a crackling sound echoing through the air as its energy weapon struck the shelter door, melting a glowing breach into the reinforced metal. Sparks flew, and the acrid smell of burning metal filled the room. It's breaching, Ryland yelled. He slammed the EMP activation switch, flooding the room with a high-pitched whine. The drone outside faltered, its optics flickering, its propulsion system sputtering. For a moment, it looked like it had worked, but then a second surge kicked in, overriding the EMP's disruption. The drone stabilized, its optics locking onto the breach it had created. Lyra moved with startling speed. She raised a hand, and for the first time, Ryland saw it, an ethereal light emanating from her palm, a strange otherworldly energy that shimmered like liquid light. The drone hesitated, its systems clearly reacting to whatever Lyra was emitting. What the hell are you? Ryland started, but his words were cut short as Lyra released the energy in a blinding pulse. The drone was thrown backward, slamming into the snow, its form sparking and twitching before becoming inert. The room fell silent again, safe save for the sound of melting snow dripping through the breach in the door. Ryland stared at her, his heart pounding. What was that? Lyra lowered her hand, her expression unreadable. A small fraction of what I am. The realization that followed brought more questions than answers. He worked quickly to seal the breach, using scrap metal and insulation foam to patch the damaged door. Lyra remained silent, watching him with a focused intensity that made his skin crawl. When he finally turned to face her, his voice was sharp. You want to explain what just happened? That wasn't standard alien biology. She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. What you saw was a defense mechanism, she said slowly. My kind are built to survive in ways you cannot understand. Try me. Lysara's luminous eyes dimmed slightly, her crystalline skin refracting pale colors in the weak light. The energy you saw is part of what sustains me. It is linked to my essence, my very being. It is also why they are hunting me. Ryland's brows furrowed. You mean the drones? They're after your what? Your energy. Partly. Her voice was distant, almost hollow. But more than that. They cannot allow me to exist. Not like this. Why not? Her gaze fell, and for a moment, she seemed almost fragile again, the light in her eyes dimming further. Because I am not supposed to be here. I should have died in the crash. My survival is an inconvenience. Ryland opened his mouth to reply, but before he could speak, the panel behind him flared to life again. Another signal, this time stronger. They have sent more, Lyra said, her voice tight with strain. Dryland cursed, moving to the panel. "This is bad," he muttered. "They'll tear this shelter apart." Lyra stepped closer, her expression resolute. "We cannot stay here. They will overwhelm us." "Then where do we go?" Ryland snapped. "The storm might have subsided, but it's still lethal out there. This shelter is the only thing keeping us alive." Lyra's glowing eyes met his, unforgiving. "Not if we stay. We must move now." The decision to leave wasn't one Ryland made easily. He quickly packed their gear, grabbing what little supplies they had left, ration packs, a portable heater, and a small oxygen tank. Lyra moved with purpose, her strength seemingly restored though her crystalline skin still shimmered with an unnatural fragility. They stepped out into the snow, the freezing cold instantly piercing their layers of clothing. The storm had abated, leaving behind a desolate landscape of ice and silence. The sky above was dark, swirling with a faint aurora that painted the horizon in ghostly hues. "This way," Lyra said, pointing towards a distant ridge. Ryland hesitated. "What's out there?" "An old facility," she said. "It was part of my survey mission. There might be something we can use." The trek was brutal. The snow was deep, the wind was biting, and every step was a struggle against the unforgiving terrain. Ryland's breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his limbs ached with the effort of carrying their gear. Lyra moved ahead, her luminous eyes scanning the horizon, her movements strangely fluid despite the harsh conditions. As they reached the ridge, a new sound broke the silence, a low mechanical hum. Ryland turned, his heart sinking. The drones had found them, and the first one swooped down quickly, its red optics glowing in the darkness. Ryland swung his ice axe as it approached, trying to clip one of its limbs. The drone faltered but didn't fall. Lyra raised her hand again, the same ethereal light emanating from her palm. This time the pulse she released was stronger, brighter, and it struck the drone with enough force to send it crashing into the snow. But more were coming. As the second drone appeared, something shifted. Lyra staggered, her glowing energy flickering. She gasped, clutching her side, and Ryland realized for the first time that her crystalline skin was cracked, faint fissures spreading like spiderwebs. "What's wrong?" he yelled, grabbing her arm to steady her. "I can't sustain it," she said through gritted teeth. "Not for long." Ryland's mind raced. They couldn't keep fighting like this, not in the open. Then, Lara looked at him, her expression hardening. "There is something I didn't tell you," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "That facility, it's not just a shelter, it's a beacon. If we activate it, it may draw them away from us." Ryland's eyes narrowed. "And who else will it draw?" Lyra did not answer. The revelation hung between them as the next drone swooped down, its optics burning red. The ridge overlooked a vast expanse of ice, punctuated by jagged veins of black rock that glittered like obsidian in the pale aurora. The cold seemed to gnawing at their insulation as if the planet itself sought to devour them. Ryland tightened his grip on his ice axe, his breath ragged, his eyes darting between Lyra and the approaching drones. The facility she had mentioned was still out of sight, but her pace didn't falter, her movement steady despite the visible cracks in her crystalline skin. She clutched at her side, her other arm hanging stiffly at her side, and though she tried to hide it, Ryland could see she was weakening. "How much farther?" he asked, his voice strained, fighting against the howling wind. Lyra didn't answer immediately. Her gaze remained fixed on the horizon, her glowing eyes dimming as if the energy that sustained her was fading. "Not far," she said finally, though her voice carried the weight of uncertainty. Ryland cursed under his breath. He didn't believe the vague promise of the facility, nor did he fully trust Lyra, but what other choice did he have? They moved quickly, the relentless wind tearing at their clothes, their boots crunching through the snow as if they were never going to end. The hum of the drones grew louder behind them, a mechanical promise of destruction that sent adrenaline coursing through Ryland's veins. "Here," Lyra said suddenly, stopping before a fissure in the ice. Beneath it, A faint metallic structure gleamed half-buried in frost. Ryland frowned. That's the facility? This is all that's left of it? The narrow hatch was frozen shut, almost invisible against the ice. Ryland struggled to clear it, hammering at the ice with his axe until his arm ached. Lyra stood nearby, her focus divided between him and the sky. They're getting closer, she warned, her voice strained. I'm moving as fast as I can, Ryland snapped, though he wasn't sure if anger or fear was fueling his words. Finally, the hatch gave way with a groan, revealing a dark passage that plunged into the depths of the ice. A stale gust of air greeted them, thick with the metallic tang of abandonment. Lyra didn't hesitate. She slipped inside, her movements agile despite her injuries. Ryland followed, his breath catching as the hatch slammed shut behind them. Inside, the facility was a maze of dark corridors and frost-covered machinery. Every surface was sheathed in a layer of ice. Emergency lights flickered weakly, casting dancing, ghostly shadows on the walls. Ryland's boots crunched on the frozen floor, the sound echoing like gunshots in the stillness. Is there power in this place? He asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Yes, Lyra replied, her breath visible in the cold air. It is running on reserves, but the beacon will function. They moved deeper into the structure, passing through rooms filled with archaic equipment, their functions long forgotten. Ryland felt the weight of the place pressing down on him, an unsettling tension that made his skin crawl. As they stepped into what appeared to be a central chamber, Lyra stopped abruptly. Her hand trembled as she pointed at a panel fixed to the wall. There, that is the beacon. Ryland approached it cautiously, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of danger. The panel was rudimentary by modern standards, its interface clunky and unresponsive. He wiped away the ice and activated it. The screen flickered to life with a soft hum. What happens if we turn it on? He asked, glancing at Lyra. She hesitated, her glowing eyes unreadable. It will draw the drones away. They will focus on the signal. That's not all, is it? Ryland pressed. Her gaze fell. It may attract others. Ryland's stomach tightened. You mean more of your kind? Lyra nodded. If they come, they will destroy everything. Me, you, this entire facility. They will not allow any trace of my survival. Ryland stared at her, the implications slowly sinking in. And you want me to activate it? It is the only way, she said softly. The weight of the decision hung heavy in the frigid air. Ryland's mind raced, calculating the odds, weighing the risks. If he activated the beacon, they might survive the drones, but at what cost? You're asking me to gamble both our lives, he said, his voice hard. Lyra stepped closer, her expression desperate. If we don't, the drones will find us here. There is no escape. At least this gives us a chance. Ryland shook his head, his frustration simmering. A chance to do what? To be hunted by something even worse. They will not come immediately, she said, her voice urgent. We will have time to escape, to find another shelter. But if we stay here, we are already dead. He turned away, running a hand through his hair. The room seemed colder, frost crawling up the walls like something alive. You do not understand what is at stake, Lyra said, her voice softer. If they capture me, they will use what is inside me, my energy, my knowledge. They will turn it into a weapon. It is not just about survival, Ryland. It is about stopping them from getting that power. Her words struck a nerve, and Ryland felt his anger dissolve, replaced by a gnawing sense of dread. He looked at her, really looked at her, the cracks in her crystalline skin, the flickering light in her eyes, the way she moved despite her pain. You're asking me to risk everything for someone I barely know, he said finally. Yes, she replied simply. The hum of the drones grew louder, their proximity a ticking clock counting down to their destruction. Ryland clenched his fist, his mind racing. He could walk away, let the drones take her, save himself. It would be the logical, the safe choice. But as he looked at Lyra, he saw something in her eyes, a sliver of trust, of hope, something he couldn't quite name. "Damn it!" he muttered under his breath. He turned back to the control panel, his hands trembling as he input the activation sequence. The beacon flared to life, its signal erupting through the facility like a siren. The drones outside faltered, their hum slowing as they recalibrated. One by one, they turned, moving towards the beacon's source. Lyra exhaled, her shoulders slumping in relief. "You did the right thing," she said softly. "I hope so," Ryland replied, his voice grim, but deep down he wasn't so sure. The beacon's signal thrummed within the facility, its vibrations resonating through the icy walls. Outside, the drones circled like predatory specters drawn to a dying ember. Their mechanical hum grew louder, sharper as they converged on the central chamber. Ryland stood at the control panel, his fingers hovering over the final overrides. Every decision weighed heavily on his mind, a silent calculation of choices that could lead to salvation or damnation. Beside him, Lyra leaned against the wall, her luminous eyes dimming and flickering. "How much time do we have?" he asked, his voice low. "Not enough," she replied, her voice hollow. "The drones are adapting to the beacon. They will breach soon." "Great," Ryland muttered. His eyes flicked to the entrance, reinforced yet still vulnerable. Every distant scrape of metal or hum of a motor sent his nerves jumping. Lyra straightened, her effort causing her to wince. The cracks in her crystalline skin shimmered faintly, spreading like fault lines. "There's something I need to tell you," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "Now?" Ryland snapped, gesturing towards the chaos outside. "Yes, because it matters." She stepped closer, her golden eyes locking onto his. "The energy within me. It is not just a weapon. It is also a key to something buried deep on this planet." Ryland frowned. "What do you mean? A key?" "There is a vault," she said, her voice growing steadier. "It holds technology my people abandoned long ago. If the ones who made the drones get their hands on it, they will gain power that could reshape galaxies." "And you didn't think to mention this sooner?" Ryland asked. "I wasn't sure I could trust you," she admitted. "But now you need to understand. If I fall into their hands, it is over for both of us, and countless more." The revelation struck Ryland like a physical blow. The stakes had always been high, but now they were incomprehensibly large. He turned back to the control panel, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. "How do we stop them?" he asked, his voice strained. Lyra hesitated. "If I release all the energy within me, I can destroy the drones and the beacon, but what?" Her gaze faltered, the dim light in her eyes fading further. "It will destroy me as well." The room fell silent. Ryan's breath caught in his throat, the full meaning of her words slowly sinking in. He turned to face her fully, his mind desperately searching for alternatives. "There has to be another way," he said, his voice defiant. "We can find the vault, seal it off." "There is no time," she interrupted. "The drones will not stop, and even if we escape, they will keep coming. This is the only way to ensure they fail." Ryland shook his head, his fists clenching at his sides. "I didn't pull you out of the snow just to watch you throw your life away." Lyra's expression softened, a faint smile touching her lips. "You didn't just save me, Ryland. You gave me a chance to fight back, to choose how it ends." The facility shuddered as the drones intensified their attack. Sparks rained down from the ceiling, and the beacon's hum became distorted, a strangled cry like a dying heartbeat. Ryland moved to the entrance, peering through the narrow viewport. The drones had formed a perimeter, their red optics scanning for weaknesses. One of them released a focused energy beam, carving through the reinforced metal with terrifying precision. "They're breaching," he said, his voice grim. Lyra stepped forward, her movements slow but purposeful. She placed a hand on his shoulder, a cold yet steady touch. "You need to leave." Ryland turned to her, his eyes blazing with defiance. "I'm not leaving you behind." "You must," she insisted. "If you stay, you will die, and everything we did will be for nothing." "I don't care," he yelled, his voice breaking. You think I can just walk away after everything? Her gaze softened, and for a moment, the harsh reality of their situation seemed to dissolve. Ryland, she said softly, you have done more for me than I could have ever asked. But this is my fight, my choice. His throat tightened, the weight of her words choking him. He wanted to argue, to fight, to find some impossible solution, but deep down he knew she was right. The final breach came with a deafening crash. The drones poured into the facility, their metallic forms glinting in the flickering light. Lyra stepped forward, her posture erect despite the visible cracks that were spreading across her body. Ryland hesitated, his heart pounding. I can't. You can, she said resolutely. And you must go now. Her voice brooked no argument. Ryland clenched his jaw, his fists trembling as he turned towards the emergency exit. He forced himself to move, every step feeling like a betrayal. As he reached the threshold, he glanced back one last time. Lyra stood at the center of the room, her luminous energy intensifying. The light radiating from her grew brighter, engulfing the chamber in a golden glow. Thank you, she said, her voice carrying an unexpected warmth. And then she released it. The explosion was blinding, a surge of energy that consumed everything in its path. The drones disintegrated instantly, their forms collapsing into molten fragments. The facility's walls buckled under the force, and Ryland barely managed to dive into the snow as the structure behind him detonated. For a moment, the world was silent. The air was thick with the aftermath of destruction. Ryland pushed himself up, his ears ringing, his heart heavy. He turned back to face the ruins, his breath catching as he saw the fading glimmer of Lyra's energy dissipating into the night. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, the weight of her sacrifice pressing down on him. She was gone, and in her absence, the storm seemed to lessen. The sky cleared, revealing a vast expanse of stars that stretched endlessly above. Ryland clenched his fist, his jaw tight. She had given everything to stop the threat, and now it was his turn to ensure her sacrifice wasn't in vain. The journey was not over, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. The sky was wide and unbroken, a canvas of deep indigo spattered with stars. The storm had broken, leaving the frozen plains still and serene, as if the planet itself was holding its breath. Ryland stood at the edge of the crater where the facility had once stood, his boots sinking into the snow, stained with a faint ashen color. The cold bit at him, but he barely felt it. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the shard of crystal light he had recovered from the rubble. It was small, barely the size of his palm, but it radiated a familiar golden light. Lyra's essence, her last gift, or perhaps her final whisper. The memories of their time together pressed down on him. He could still hear her voice, see the defiant light in her eyes. She had been more than a fleeting companion in this harsh isolation. She had become something he couldn't fully define, something worth fighting for. Ryland turned away from the crater and began to walk, his steps purposeful despite the weariness that clung to him. He had sketched out a rough course towards the vault Lyra had spoken of, a place buried deep beneath the ice, where secrets older than the storms awaited, not only to honor her sacrifice but to ensure it meant something. If the vault's contents were as dangerous as she had said, it could not fall into the hands of anyone or anything. The trek was arduous, the wind returning with a vengeance, tearing at his clothes and sapping his strength. His rations were running low, the remaining scraps barely enough to keep him moving, but Ryland pushed on, driven by a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. The vault's entrance was hidden within a jagged canyon, its walls sheathed in frozen waterfalls that glittered like glass. Ryland carefully made his way down, his every movement calculated. The ice underfoot was treacherous, threatening to crumble with each step. When he finally reached the bottom, he saw it, a massive door carved from a metallic alloy that glimmered faintly even in the dim light. Strange symbols adorned its surface, their meanings lost to time. He placed his hand on the door, the cold biting at his skin even through his gloves. The shard in his pocket vibrated faintly as if in response to his proximity. With a deep breath, Ryland drew the shard and held it to the door. The reaction was instantaneous, a golden light spreading across its surface, illuminating the symbols. The door groaned, ancient mechanisms springing back to life. Slowly it began to open. Inside, the vault was a stark contrast to the frozen world outside. It was warm, the air thick with the hum of dormant machinery. An array of complex devices stretched into the distance, their design alien and incomprehensible. Ryland moved cautiously, his eyes scanning for anything that might pose a threat. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that he would recognize it when he found it. At the center of the chamber, he stopped. A platform rose from the floor, its surface smooth and unblemished. Atop it sat an orb of light, its luminosity gentle yet intensely bright. The shard in his hand vibrated again, more urgently now. "This is it," he muttered, his voice barely more than a whisper. He stepped closer, his instincts screaming at him to be cautious. The orb seemed to react to his presence, its light shifting subtly as if it were alive. Ryland hesitated. What was he supposed to do? Destroy it? Take it away? The answers felt just out of reach. And then he remembered Lyra's words. "The energy within me is a key." He placed the shard on the platform just beneath the orb. The reaction was immediate, the orb pulsating violently, its light flaring brighter than the sun. Ryland recoiled, shielding his eyes as the chamber filled with a palpable hum. The light solidified, drawing inwards before exploding outward in a wave of warmth and stillness. When Ryland opened his eyes, the orb was gone. The platform was empty, its surface again smooth and unblemished. The vault felt different. The hum of machinery had ceased, leaving an almost sacred silence in its place. Ryland exhaled slowly, the tension in his chest easing. Whatever power had been locked away here, it was no longer a threat. The trek back to the surface was arduous, but Ryland moved with a purpose. The storm had returned, fierce and relentless, but he pushed onward. When he finally emerged from the canyon, the horizon was painted with the faint hues of dawn. The storm clouds had broken just enough to reveal the sun, its light weak but resolute. Ryland paused, letting the moment wash over him. He reached into his pocket, his fingers touching the emptiness where the shard had been. Lyra was gone, but her presence lingered in the silence of the vault, in the warmth of the sun, in the person he had become. And the path ahead was uncertain, the frozen planet as unforgiving as ever, and the galaxy beyond held its own dangers. But Ryland felt a strange peace, a clarity he had never known before. He tightened his coat, adjusted his pack, and began to walk. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward. The frozen world swallowed his footprints, but the echo of his journey remained, a solitary figure against an endless expanse, carrying the light of a sacrifice that would never fade.